People nowadays love to talk about what a litigious society we live in. It doesn't matter what industry or what walk of life you're in, there is somebody suing somebody. And while there's certainly a degree of truth to this, lawsuits are nothing new, which I'm sure you all know. But what you might not know is back in 1985, when the now Tennessee Titans were still the Houston Oilers, they attempted to launch a lawsuit against the NFL and its commissioner, Pete Rozelle. The lawsuit was a massive headline, and within days, it quickly became national news. And with the NFL draft rapidly approaching, the narrative created quite a frenzy. It even created the possibility that the draft would be delayed. Our story starts a few weeks out of the draft, which was to be held at Omni Park Central Hotel in New York City on April 30th. And what's more important is what was set to follow the traditional draft day festivities, the supplemental draft. We have seen several iterations of the supplemental draft throughout the past few decades, as it has transformed along with the landscapes of both collegiate and professional sports. Since 1993, the supplemental draft has only admitted players who had originally planned to attend college but for various reasons could not. Like Maurice Claret, who was famously taken in the 2005 NFL supplemental draft after a series of run-ins with Ohio State's administration and the NCAA, which forced him out of collegiate football a year early. That change marked the second time in 3 years that the NFL reformatted the supplemental draft. In 1990, the NFL had changed it to service the players who had graduated or exhausted their college eligibility. And before that, it had been open to any draft-eligible player who, for whatever reason, had not entered the regular NFL draft. During the original rollout of the supplemental draft, players would typically use it if they had missed the filing deadline for the draft or if they had run into eligibility issues in college, whether it be an academic or disciplinary issue. And since its inception in 1977, that's how it was used. Sparsely and without much attention. In fact, there really wasn't a ton of written rules or regulations surrounding it either, because it was just sort of a cast aside and viewed as an unimportant extension of the regular draft. But in 1985, one-star quarterback and a rather creative agent who, interestingly, didn't even represent the QB, implemented a brilliant scheme that delighted one franchise, enraged a handful of others, and even spawned some intra-league litigation. The player was Bernie Kosar, who had won the national championship at the University of Miami in 1983, finished as a Heisman finalist in 1984, and had since skyrocketed up the draft boards in NFL war rooms across the league. During his final season in Coral Gables, when he earned a trip to New York as a Heisman Trophy finalist, he put up numbers that were monstrous for the era he played in, notching 3,642 passing yards and 25 touchdowns. It wasn't just his impressive regular season stat lines that were drawing all of his attention. It was the way he played in big games and crucial moments. In that '83 National Championship Orange Bowl, he led the 11-1 Hurricanes into a buzzsaw of a Nebraska team that had won 22 straight games. The Cornhuskers came into the game favored by double digits, but Kosar was unfazed, and the game was tightly contested all the way through, largely thanks to Kosar. He passed for 300 yards and 2 touchdowns, leading to an all-time great upset as the Hurricanes topped the Cornhuskers 31-30. These kinds of performances started to draw attention from the Houston Oilers and the Minnesota Vikings, who had held picks number 2 and 3 respectively. Both teams, along with the Buffalo Bills, who had held the number 1 overall pick, were coming off of disappointing seasons, but only the Vikings were really in the market for a new quarterback. The Bills had recently signed quarterback Vince Ferragamo away from the Rams, so they had their starter locked in. Oh, and they just so happened to own the draft rights to another former Hurricanes quarterback, Jim Kelly, who'd been playing in the USFL. And while Kelly was lighting it up, the upstart league appeared to be on its last legs. So Buffalo was anticipating the dream of Jim Kelly in a Bills uniform to turn into a reality sooner rather than later. Besides, there was rumored to be a runaway lock for the number 1 pick that year, Bruce Smith, the 2-time All-American defensive tackle out of Virginia Tech, who Buffalo would end up signing weeks before the draft even happened. Up next was the Oilers. Houston had just signed a quarterback in Warren Moon, who had been decimating the competition up north in the CFL, so there was no real need at quarterback there either. But Minnesota was interested. The Vikings did have a guy they liked in 2-minute Tommy Kramer, who is beloved by the Minnesota fanbase for his countless late-game come-from-behind victories. And don't forget his grit, as he played through countless injuries during his decade-plus run with the Vikes. But he hadn't been able to finish a season since 1981. Having played just 21 total games during the 3 previous seasons combined, and the ownership group was beginning to think he never would. That prompted some conversation between Minnesota and Houston about a potential trade that would move the Vikings up to second, positioning them to land Kosar. The two sides agreed on a deal. Houston would swap spots with Minnie, and the Vikes would throw in an additional second-round pick in that year's draft. But this was back in 1985, and the rules surrounding eligibility for the NFL draft were surprisingly even more restrictive than they are nowadays. Back then, college players couldn't leave school early for the NFL. There was, however, one exception: if they graduated early. This was very uncommon, but nevertheless, it opened up another grand opportunity for Kosar and super agent AJ Fagan, who had just so happened to represent Jim Kelly. Fagan had allegedly struck a deal with Kosar's father, Bernie Kosar Sr., to help bring his son back to Cleveland, and now they were in a prime position to capitalize. Kosar was raised in a very strict household growing up, one that placed a huge emphasis on discipline and education, both of which the young quarterback brought with him to the University of Miami. And heading into the spring semester of his redshirt junior season, he needed just 24 credits to graduate early with a double major in finance and economics. Obviously, completing that many credit hours is no small task. But once Fagan's strategy became clear to the Kosar clan, it was a no-brainer. But because there's so many moving pieces to Fagan's master plan, the two played it close to the vest. Even when a Florida television report aired in January of '85, stating that Kosar decided to forego his 2 years of eligibility and declare for the NFL draft. They denied the report, explaining they were simply keeping their options open. Once March rolled around, though, it was time to make moves. Kosar held a press conference and announced that he would make himself available for the 1985 draft, and that he would like to play for one team and one team only, the Cleveland Browns.
I'm going to finish out this semester, which is going to end in about 10 days, and then in all likelihood make myself available for the supplemental draft.
I know, this sounds like a laughable assertion nowadays. But who in their right mind demands to play for the Browns? But Kosar was born and raised in Youngstown, Ohio, and was adamant about returning to his roots and playing for his childhood team.
It's a question, I think, of me being from the area, my commitments towards the Youngstown, Cleveland area, and me basically just wanting to go home.
As nice as that all sounds, the Browns, however, held the number 7 overall pick, so they weren't really in a position to pick Kosar, not with the Vikings at 3, and especially not once they finalized their deal with Houston to move up to number 2. Now, bear with me for a second here, as the timeline is important. Kosar's announcement was March 15th, and the deal between Minnesota and Houston was made official on April 9th. And the draft was to be held on April 30th. There is one other date that is important here, April 15th, which was the deadline for college players to file with the NFL to enter the draft. A deadline that, after hearing of the trade, Fagan instructed Kosar's father not to formally submit Bernie's application for the standard NFL draft. The 15th came and went, and Kosar Sr. followed the plan masterfully, intentionally missing the deadline, setting the plan in motion. Because of how the regulations around the deadline were structured, any draft-eligible player who missed it would not be eligible for the draft on April 30th. Instead, they'd be entered into the pools of players selected in this supplemental draft, Kosar included.
He could have taken enough hours to graduate in May, and then he would have been eligible for a regular draft. Or he could wait, take the rest in the summer, and be eligible to play in the NFL.
Behind the scenes, Fagan was playing puppet master. Because the Bills had the worst record during the 1984 season, they not only had the number 1 overall pick in the regular draft, but also the supplemental draft. So Fagan went ahead and reached out to Bill Polian, who was the Bills' general manager at the time, to ask if Buffalo would be willing to trade its number 1 supplemental draft pick, which was viewed as a worthless asset at the time, to Cleveland. Polian, who obviously wanted to stay in good graces with the agent directing the team's most prized asset, Jim Kelly, agreed to do so. And Fagan reached out to Cleveland to let them know that the trade was available. Cleveland, eager to make Kosar a Brown, jumped at the opportunity and traded their first-round picks in the 1985 and 1986 NFL drafts, along with their third-round pick in 1985 and their sixth-round pick in 1986, to the Bills in exchange for Buffalo's first-round pick in the 1986 NFL draft. This was pivotal in securing Kosar a spot in Cleveland, because in accordance with the original regulations of the supplemental draft, if a team made a selection, they had to forfeit the same pick in the regular draft the following year. The deal, shady as it may have been, really was a win-win for Cleveland and Buffalo. The Bills got solid draft assets to continue bolstering the roster until Kelly finally arrived, and Cleveland was able to get its guy by circumventing the traditional draft. Honestly, Fagan drew up a brilliant strategy to capitalize on the lack of structure in place at the time. Needless to say, Minnesota and Houston were absolutely incensed, and both organizations effectively ran crying to the commissioner's office, demanding that Pete Rozelle step in and do something about such a grave injustice. But, much to their chagrin, Rozelle decided that his only action would be to extend the submission deadline for Kosar and leave it up to him. enter the regular draft, or wait a few months for the supplemental draft. This only enraged Minnesota and Houston more, as they both knew full well what the Ohio native was going to choose. Houston went as far as to call out both Cleveland and Buffalo publicly, as well as stating its intention to sue Rozelle and the NFL for having acted in an arbitrary and capricious manner. The media frenzy began to spiral out of control, and many even began to wonder if the draft would be delayed by a judiciary injunction. As it turns out, Minnesota got cold feet about the idea of a lawsuit and bowed out, subsequently putting pressure on Houston to do the same. And the NFL draft went on as scheduled, without Bernie Kosar, who would go on to be selected to 2 Pro Bowls as a member of the Cleveland Browns. What other crazy NFL draft stories would you like to hear about? Join us in the comments section below. If you liked this video and learned a thing or two, clicking the like button helps us out a ton, and we appreciate it. If this is your first time coming around to TPS though, subscribing is a great idea because we put out videos like this every single day. But as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.